Bring Your Own Security Radio is just about ready to start. Hosted by certified ethical hacker and CISSP Dave the IT Guy. Sit back as we talk about hackers, security, crypto, and other things you should be paying attention to. Along with our many guests, we'll also talk about tools and methods to get the job done to keep your data where it belongs, with you. Okay, Dave is up to the mic and ready to go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
That's right. The crowd goes wild. Woo! I am Dave, the IT guy. Hey, thanks for tuning in tonight. Special guest, although I did pre-record this interview 2 days ago because of the time difference between me being in the United States and our guest, Troy Hunt from HaveIBeenPwned.com, is based in Australia. So we had to do some time magic finagling, but for the next hour, hopefully you'll enjoy what he had to say, and I can't say enough about how much I appreciate his time. Before we do jump into that interview, which, by the way, is 53 minutes long, I do want to remind everybody about one of my most favorite events ever, and that is heavy metal music festivals on a global scale. But here in Ohio, where I am based, there's always been a great event up in Columbus, Ohio. This year, a new event is taking place up there starting in May. It's called the Sonic Temple Festival. Yeah, so if you're into heavy metal, you don't want to miss this. And if you are going, hey, reach out to me before the weekend starts, and I'll see you up there.
The Sonic Temple Art and Music Festival has arrived. MAPFRE Stadium, Columbus, Ohio, May 17th through the 19th, with Foo Fighters, System of a Down, Are you ready? Disturbed, with Bring Me the Horizon, Prodigy, Ghost, Hailstorm, Lamb of God, The Cult, Andrew Dice Clay, and more. Go to SonicTempleFestival.com for everything. See ya at the temple.
Yeah, that's right. Even Andrew Dice Clay and Pauly Shore, he'll be up there as well. So it should be a great 3-day event. Every other event that's been up there for the last 12 years has been awesome. I can't wait to go. I'm a heavy metal fan at heart. I like to get into the mosh pit myself. So, hey, man, let's go have some fun. All right, so let's get on to it. So Troy Hunt, if you don't know, I'm not sure where you are if you don't know him, founded HaveIBeenPwned.com, a website who does breach notifications based on people who send him stuff, and you'll hear it. But why is this guy important, man? He's an all-around security researcher, been around the industry 20 years, knows what he's doing, has worked for quite a few companies, and has some very special designations coming out of Microsoft, which, although he doesn't get paid for that, you'll hear what he has to say about those designations and the kind of access that affords him. So very cool stuff. Appreciate you tuning in tonight, and I'll see you in about 52 minutes.
All right, well, the time has come, and as promised, here he is. He probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to quickly introduce him anyway. And if you've never heard the name Troy Hunt, by the time this interview is over, you'll be Googling like you've never Googled before. And if he doesn't scare the crap out of you, then you probably weren't paying attention. So without any further ado, Troy, are you with us?
That's a great intro. I'm definitely with you.
Right on, man. Hey, so, for those of us in the IT industry, we've all heard of you for some reason or another. Your websites, and I'll let you have the honor of introducing the different sites and companies and organizations that you've been involved with. But let's just kind of jump back for a second before we start talking about all the cool stuff you did, and let's figure out kind of how you got there. My understanding of your story has you going from point A to point B in life without really ever thought IT was going to be your thing, and then you just fell into it. So take a minute and just kind of tell us how you started off and where you were in life that got you into IT.
I think you sort of have to go far enough back for me to sort of remember a time where I wasn't going to do an IT thing, and far enough back would be as a teenager. In fact, even as a preteen, I wanted to be a pilot because my dad was a pilot, and kids want to do what their parents do. So that was my plan A, and then I kind of realized that the airline industry was kind of hard. Now, as it turns out, the IT industry is kind of hard as well, but the airline industry was hard in different ways. So I got through until probably around about the age of 15, 16. And then I sort of started looking around me and getting a lot more interested in technology. And part of it was that as a son of an airline pilot, we moved around the world a bit, and I was living in Singapore at the time, and it was sort of a tech hub. And every time I turned around, there was some sort of cool technology there, and it just kind of started to draw me in. So, I think really probably since about 15 years old, I was like, okay, this is what I'd like to do.
So what was some of the first stuff that you can put your name to, or that you feel like, hey, this is where I belong, and this is me, this is who I am, and kind of kept you with us in the IT world, so to speak? But, what was it that really kind of tripped your trigger, so to speak?
Well, initially I sort of shuffled around between a few different things. So when I think about sort of the first sort of jobs I ever had in terms of any professional capacity, I had a part-time job at a satellite systems engineering company in Singapore, sort of fixing broken PCs, very sort of hardware-based stuff. Similar sort of deal once I moved back to Australia to go to university when I was 18. It was hardware-based, Hey, it's like my PC keeps crashing. Well, you've got dodgy RAM, doing this sort of thing. And around about that time as well, I started doing some sort of part-time work whilst at university, helping people get on the internet. And we're sort of talking about the mid-90s kind of era here, and internet was very, very new. So I'd be spending time with people, mums and dads, normal folks, getting them online, teaching them how to use the web. And I started to get really interested in the web. And particularly whilst I was at university and I was learning programming languages, unfortunately nothing like JavaScript or HTML or anything useful like that. It was like COBOL. While I was there, I was like, well, this web stuff is super, super cool. This is what I want to do. And that really is what took my career off and what has stuck with me to this day. And interestingly, I'm teaching my 9-year-old son a whole bunch of coding stuff, including building web pages. And he's learning out of the same book that I did in 95. He's learning out of HTML5 for Dummies. In fact, sorry, it was HTML for Dummies. We didn't have HTML5. Didn't have HTML4 then. And I just found it really, really curious that the same stuff that I was learning to build the web 24 years ago is still the same fundamental principles that we have today. We just do very different stuff with it.
Well, one of the questions I wanted to get into was your son and your viewpoint, but since you brought him up, what, if anything, what was your vision of the internet? And as you got into the security and the scary side of what the internet has to offer, what was your view, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, compared to what your view might be like now that you have a 9-year-old son and you're helping to clearly break him into this field? Is there anything that you can point to that says, wow, I've really kind of changed my opinion or my thought process on?
The first thing that came to mind when you said that is I really clearly remember 20 years ago. So I remember 99, early 99, and I remember being at this time where you were sort of at the height of .com, and everything was very exciting, and there were companies throwing ridiculous amounts of money around for ridiculous things. And I remember at the time thinking, like, this is crazy. Like, I could just be like sitting here on my own writing HTML and building things that could actually have a fundamental impact on the world, or grow into really big things that everybody knows. And I can do it sort of on a shoestring. And I had lots of good ideas of how I was going to do that. And none of them were any good until very recently with Have I Been Pwned. But I have had multiple occasions in more recent years where I sort of thought back to that time and went, I knew there was something in this, like I knew you could do something super cool at home on your own. And of course it took a heavy dosage of cloud as well to actually be able to do that. But, this is now the reality. It is possible to do these things. And that's still sort of, to me, like the magic of the internet.
Excuse me, just a moment ago you mentioned about, going back home to Australia and teaching parents and others about how this new fad called the internet was working. Nowadays, with just how the world is, unfortunately, do you find that parents are too far behind the curve as far as compared to their kids? And what, if anything, can we do as people that are familiar with IT? How can we help these folks who are not very internet savvy catch up to their kids and help keep their kids safe? Is there much we can do?
Look, I feel a great deal of sympathy for parents today who don't live in the world that we live in, and their kids are growing up in this world where everyone is connected. They're quote-unquote internet natives. They've never known a time without internet, without really liberal sharing of information, very, very different set of sensitivities around things like privacy. And these kids are sort of going headlong into what is now their world, and parents who haven't given this much thought are like, what do we do? Do we install a firewall, or God forbid, do we install like spyware on kids' devices? And in fact, this is a tangential thing. There's a massive bugbear of mine seeing people install these spyware products, and then the number of data breaches of spyware products is just ridiculous. But the thing is, it reminds me that parents really, for the most part, are living in a world that their children understand better than them, and it must be very, very difficult for those folks. And it's really hard even for, I find it hard enough sometimes just to teach people how to create an online account and turn on 2FA. How are you going to teach them to actually monitor their children? I have this perhaps, maybe, I don't want to say old-fashioned thinking, but perhaps a way of thinking that's probably a little bit different to many other people, which is that for my kids, I think the best way to help them grow up in an internet age is to have discussions about the sorts of things that are on the internet and what's appropriate and what's not, and the immutability of putting things on the internet. I talk to my son and go, mate, if you put something on there, you got to assume it's never coming off. So you got to be really, really sensible about that. So I think the one thing that every parent can do, regardless of their tech savviness, is to have mature discussions with their children.
That's exactly right. We are speaking with Troy Hunt from Have I Been Pwned and a million of other sources that you could probably find his name. So let's jump into some of that. So globally, you have spoken in person at several events in many countries. You've written books or articles. You've written for companies. You've worked for some pretty big name companies. Let's talk a little bit about that wide range of experience and where one might have helped you with the other, if possible. Did you have an experience at a job function that helped you when you went to go talk about something at an event, or vice versa? Did you hear something at an event where you went back to an employer and said, hey, we forgot X, or any kind of crossover like that?
So thinking back on it, let me see now, what was the year? In 2001, I started working for Pfizer, the drug company, and I ended up spending about 14 years there, which was never the plan. It just worked out that way. And the role that I had through the sort of the last half of that period was I looked after our application architecture for Asia Pacific, and I spent a lot of time either traveling or on the phone with people in different parts of the world where English wasn't a first language. The communication context was very different. There's a very different communication style in somewhere like China compared to the US or Australia. And also I was working with a lot of people who were either not technical at all in terms of working with business partners, or had a degree of technicality. So, maybe they were project managers, for example, but not coders per se. And I found myself spending a lot of time trying to articulate things into terms that they could consume. So, how do we take something technical and then explain it to someone who lives in a different world? And I think that set me up really well for a combination of different things. The blogging, so how do I use this medium to explain something complex to an audience that may not be familiar with it already? Through to the speaking, so I do a lot of talks at tech conferences, and they're sort of people on the same wavelength mostly. But then there's increasingly there's more talks for other parts of society that don't live in that world. I've done talks at schools for teachers, or talks for financial institutions to accountants. I spoke at Congress about a year and a half ago in DC. So speaking to audiences like that is very, very different. And frankly, one of the things that I've enjoyed a lot is trying to figure out what's the right message to give these people that they can consume, that can make an impact that isn't too fluffy, but still is delivered at a level that they understand and then can actually do something with it.
One of the many titles that you've attained or owned or been given or whatever the words might be is Microsoft MVP. For those that aren't familiar with what that function means, describe a little bit about what that has afforded for you to be able to do and what it truly means to anyone else.
So Microsoft gives me a couple of titles which the MVP one's slightly confusing, the other one's even more confusing, so I'll touch on both of them. The MVP one is the Most Valuable Professional Award, and Microsoft has had this program going for more than a couple of decades now. And the MVP award goes to people who demonstrate competency within a certain Microsoft technology stack and are community-centric. So, for example, I got my first Microsoft MVP award in 2011 for developer security because I was writing a lot of material about how do you secure software written on Microsoft's stack. There are MVPs for Xbox, there are MVPs for Microsoft Excel, and they all sort of have their own technical specialty in a certain area. And then the other one, which makes it even more confusing, is my Microsoft Regional Director title, which I've had for the last few years now. And there's a much smaller number of regional directors. We're not granted that title for any one given technology, but for broader levels of influence. Influence for large organizations, influence for government. And both of these awards don't pay me any money, which is a bit of a shame, but they're nice titles. But they do get me access to a lot of Microsoft people, which is really useful. So there's a lot of people there that I can tap into, either through sort of the formal channels for the MVP and RD programs, or through the annual event in Seattle. So each March it is, in fact next month, I'll be going off to Seattle for a week and spending time looking at the things that Microsoft are building, giving them some feedback on that, learning about what's in the pipeline and how I can use that to make things like Have I Been Pwned better.
Well, just to be clear, I've always considered myself an Xbox MVP when it comes to Call of Duty. No official recognition on that title. So just
that always sounds like a good gig, doesn't it? You know, Xbox MVP.
That's right. I can't figure out how to scroll away that into making money either. Some of those Xbox gamers that travel on a global basis and get paid all this money and sponsors and things, I just haven't figured that out, but awesome. So let's jump right into the site that everybody that really probably knows you knows most about, and that's the Have I Been Pwned. Let's talk a little bit about where that came from in your mind and why that came to be, and then we're going to kind of dive into what makes it different from some other sites that might not be so nice about things. But at least, what was in your mind when you thought, man, I want to put this kind of thing together and I'm going to open it up to the public, and where did that inspiration come from?
Well, there were two things really, and the time frame matters here as well. So this was late 2013, and in October 2013 there'd been the Adobe data breach, more than 150 million records exposed, including both my personal and work accounts. Thanks, Adobe. So they were out there floating around the web, and I'd been doing a lot of blogging at the time, looking at data breaches and looking at quantifiable metrics around things like password reuse. You know, like we all know that people reuse passwords. We know that anecdotally, but it's a different thing to actually see that same password in multiple different data breaches against the same email address. So I've been doing a bunch of analysis, and as I saw these patterns emerge, I sort of thought, well, I wonder if these people know, I wonder if the people in the Adobe data breach know that they're in there, but they were also in these other ones as well. And I thought, all right, well, this will be a fun project. I whipped a lot of it up, actually, in a combination of airplane and hotel room in the Philippines, because I just had downtime while I was on a trip there. And that was sort of part of the motivation. The other part of the motivation was that I wanted to build something on Microsoft's Azure cloud platform. And I didn't want to build Hello World, sort of the canonical basic application. I wanted to build something of substance. And 150 plus million records is substantial. So they were sort of the two equally important objectives. And it's really interesting to sort of see over time how both of those have remained very important. I'm off to Sydney tomorrow to speak at a Microsoft event where I'm going to be talking a lot about the technology behind what powers Have I Been Pwned and how I've built that. And it's been fun sort of building a project that has a purpose and has use, but also demonstrates some really, really super cool cloud stuff.
As you mentioned, I'm going to rabbit hole for a second, but you mentioned, purposely choosing the Azure base for that development. Was that because you had some back-end thought, hey, everybody says Microsoft is too easily hacked, or, were you trying to also see if you could build something that wouldn't get hacked? Do you see even today that you're getting hack attempts left and right? Do you even monitor that stuff? Where was any of that part of the process at all at that point in time?
Well, the motivation really for going down that Azure path is I was pushing that quite heavily within Pfizer. So we'd sort of come from this, I guess like many large organizations, a pretty fragmented background of everything from on-premise hosting through to lots of different independent hosting environments for externally facing web assets in different countries, because many of the countries operated autonomously at the time. And I really wanted to start trying to consolidate things. And in fact, only a few years earlier, I'd gone through a consolidation process where we put a lot of assets in shared hosting models with a provider in the US, where they effectively gave us a virtual machine, and from that virtual machine, they sliced off different individual instances of websites and said, here you go, you can put 80 websites on this machine or whatever else it may be. And when Microsoft really started gaining traction with Azure, and early on, there were a bunch of things that they did with the platform which frankly just didn't work well for us. We didn't really have a paradigm of running a website like I could go and put on another shared hosting provider. But as they started building out, particularly their platform as a service offerings, where they said, look, you have a website, you can run it on here. You don't have to worry about the underlying operating system or patching that or backing it up. We do all that. Just put your things here in the cloud. That was when I really wanted to sort of drive that harder within the organization. And part of my education was to go out and actually build some stuff in my own time on that and understand the platform better so I could demonstrate it. So that's what really drove me down that path. I never had any questions around the security posture. It was more around how can I learn the technology better.
So now that you have been on that platform for so long, and now that I don't want to say that your entire career path has diverged into security only, because clearly it has not, but how in recent years has security played into the role of that site and the role of how you look at things? And even as you mentioned going into Seattle next month, how will the security and the OPSEC side of things play into your feedback, and where it plays into the things that you look at now within your own stuff, within your own ecology of things that you have going on?
Well, earlier on you mentioned, do I see attacks against Have I Been Pwned? Well, it's an internet website, yes. So I always joke a little bit, see how long it takes to actually stand something up before your logs are full of crawlers and bots trying to do all sorts of nasty stuff. So Have I Been Pwned? Yeah, it certainly continues to get hammered by all the normal stuff that every website is subject to. And then, of course, a bunch of targeted stuff too. People want to either try and find vulnerabilities in the code, or they want to try and exploit the API to do mass enumeration of accounts or whatever else it may be. So it's sort of been interesting to run that project and look at, as it grows in prominence, what do those attacks look like, and what do I actually have to do to fend them off? Fortunately, for the most part, Have I Been Pwned is actually a really, really simple application. There's very, very little it actually does, certainly compared to many online assets. And not only that, but when we think about things like mass enumeration of data, or what if someone could break in and get everything? Well, the whole purpose of it is that it's full of stuff that's already out there. Most of the stuff's already out there, which fortunately kind of means it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to invest too much effort into breaking into it. But that said, there's certainly changes I've made over the years as well. One of the things I did a few years ago is I started using Cloudflare really extensively. So Cloudflare now sits in front of that. They do a huge amount of bot and attack mitigation that means that I never even see a lot of the traffic on the Have I Been Pwned side. I do a lot of configuration of firewalls to try and reduce the amount of abusive traffic and keep the good stuff in. And part of that as well sort of goes back to that original use case for Have I Been Pwned, and that this gives me a learning experience. So I've been able to learn a lot about the way Cloudflare operates and have consequently written and spoken quite a bit about that. And again, I'll be speaking about that this week in Sydney too. And that to me has been part of the enjoyment of running the service as well, getting to use technology not just in a sort of hypothetical hello world way, but to actually put it out there at scale.
All right. So one of the questions I had put last week, I had put out on Twitter that I was going to be interviewing you, and I asked for some questions that others might want to ask you if they had a chance to speak with you. So one of the questions was going to be, how have, of the data that you obtain, how do you get that data? Do you have hackers reach out to you? Do you collate that data yourself? I guess I'll add a caveat for as much as you want to say, or your secrets that you don't want to give. You don't have to, but that's a question. How do you get it?
I'm not going to name names, but other than that, I'm very transparent about it. People send it to me. It's really that simple. Pretty much everything that goes into Have I Been Pwned today, and for that matter, for many years in the past now, has been people supporting the project. And frankly, I mean, that's one of the things that I think has made it very successful, and that there's enough people out there traveling in these circles where data is breached and then traded that support the project, that they regularly reach out and say, hey, here you go. And it's really, I would say on average, multiple times a day, someone reaches out and they say, here's everything from, I searched for my email address and I found it in a paste of alleged Spotify credentials, through to a few weeks ago, I loaded data that was 773 million records. And every single one of those incidents is someone reaching out saying, here's data that I think people should know about. And then, of course, the people that reach out are from all sorts of different walks of life. There are very, very mainstream, well-known white hat security researchers who I often reference and credit when the data is loaded, through to people who are probably responsible for having taken the data in the first place, which then, of course, creates all sorts of other moral dilemmas as well. But there's just a really broad spectrum of people out there who want to support the project, and that makes it much easier for me to run it the way I do.
All right. One more question from a listener was, how much time do you spend trolling or proactively lurking on the dark web?
Very little. In fact, I always laugh when I hear dark web. I'm writing something at the moment about the amount of data floating around in these credential stuffing lists, just big lists of email addresses and passwords from all sorts of different sources made to effectively go and mount account takeover attacks on different services. And I've sort of quoting a news article in here, which is like 2.2 billion records found on the dark web, and it all sounds very scary. And I'm like, no, it's not usually the dark web. Here's a tweet to about 20 billion records, that you can just go and download. So, the dark web side of things, in all honesty, it's very, if we sort of put it in pure technical terms, it's very infrequent that I'll actually go to a Tor hidden service in order to access information, because most of the time it is out there floating around in pretty mainstream circles.
So to take a quick rabbit hole down the dark web corridor, for me, what if any, I'm asking this on the fly, so I need to think before I speak, but can you articulate, or is there any use in articulating the different things that you find on the dark web, the services, for the denial, DDoS services, or the hacker services, or the whatever services, the selling of military things, whatever. Is it really as bad as media likes to make it sound in your eyes? Is it not exposed enough? Our governments, clearly different governments around the globe, are trying to take down sites and things like that, but is it anything that's ever going to truly be stopped, or is it really something that we should worry about that much?
It sort of is, and it isn't as bad, depending on your perspective. And the penny dropped for me only a couple of weeks ago. A friend of mine was asking about, air quotes, the dark web. And she had not seen the dark web before, and I was like, okay, hold my beer. Like, here we go, let's go and take a look. So I opened up the Tor browser bundle, which is based on Firefox, looks like a normal browser, and it's like, okay, we're on the dark web. And she's like, well, it looks like the normal web. It's like, yeah, I know. Like it looks like the normal web. So the accessibility of the dark web and the experience when you're on there is something that's very familiar. So that part of it is like, well, it's not so scary. It's just an anonymity network. That's all it is. But then you dive into one of these marketplaces and you look at the sorts of things that are traded there. And the thing that always gets me, and I do this in some conference talks as well, is I sort of show marketplace on the dark web and go, see how this is, it's basically like eBay. Like even the design's terrible. It's just like eBay, right? And it's all reputation based. And you can go through the different taxonomy of items that they sell, and you can decide how you ship and how you pay. And so much of this is just completely analogous to the way we do any sort of online shopping, except it's like drugs and porn and that's on the clear web as well, but all sorts of legal things that you would never sort of imagine would be that easily accessible, and now they're just sitting here behind a browser. And this friend of mine's looking at this, and she's sort of like, well, why don't they just shut the site down? Well, that's kind of the nature of an anonymity service. Many of them have been shut down. Silk Road's gone, Alphabet's gone, Hansa Market's gone. People are in jail for life or dead as a result. So there's kind of a serious side to this as well. But we want to have these anonymity networks for all sorts of really good reasons. And the moral neutrality of encryption and of technology in general means that sometimes there's some bad stuff there too.
Wow. So I know you didn't know this, but that's a great segue into one of my next questions that kind of have nothing to do with websites, but you mentioned about the neutrality of encryption and privacy, and things like law firms or judges, organizations trying to get companies to offer decryption keys, a la the Apple story, or any other possible NSA level things that they're trying to do. Where do you stand on those type of attempts? Do you stay as neutral? Have you been involved in both sides maybe? How do you feel about that type of intrusion, for lack of a better phrase?
Look, I certainly have a lot of discussions on both sides. I do a lot of work with government lately and spend a lot of time seeing folks in government, some of the folks responsible for these policies. And what I hear from them is they say, look, it's actually really hard these days when there is such a huge amount of communications that's encrypted by default in very mainstream technologies. And whereas, let's say go back a couple of decades ago, in order for us to do our policing work and basically stop us from getting blown up or all these other things we don't want to happen, we could go and lawfully access communications. Now it's really hard. And regardless of your view on privacy, you can't argue that fact. Yes, it's a lot harder. Now it's a lot harder for good people, and it's a lot harder for bad people as well. So I understand their challenge. Then, of course, on the other side, we're just really, really conscious that we've seen so many precedents in the industry where attempts to weaken encryption or weaken the privacy of communications has had very negative outcomes as a result. So we're sort of really concerned on that side as well. What I'm finding at the moment, and Australia is a really good example of this because we've just had our Access and Assistance Bill passed, which is sort of apparently some of the strictest laws in the world around what governments can compel technology companies to do. What I'm seeing here is that somewhere in the middle between two very extreme positions is probably a rational solution. And what I mean by these extreme positions is on the one hand, we see things like our previous Prime Minister, this is an embarrassing thing, but he was grilled by the press on proposed encryption laws. And someone from the press said, look, encryption's just mathematics. Like, how are you going to ban the law of mathematics? And Malcolm Turnbull says, well, the laws of mathematics are admirable, but the only laws that count in Australia are the laws of Australia. Mate, you're not helping. You're making it worse. Shut up. But then you sort of get to this other side of things where people on the extreme privacy end say, well, look, no one should have access to any communications whatsoever. And they send this message from the safety and sanctity of their own homes whilst not being blown up. So it's kind of like usually between two extreme viewpoints, the sanity rests somewhere in the middle. And unfortunately, I really don't know what the right answer is. I really don't know how we do this. I suspect we'll see more sort of San Bernardino cases where governments want to compel tech companies for access to information and tech companies don't want to give on that. We'll have to see what levers can actually be pulled. Look, if it's Apple, that's one thing because they want to sell products in Australia. They have stores. If it's Signal or Telegram, well, good luck. Yeah, I can't see the government being able to get access to that communication, at least not by compelling those tech companies to provide access.
I had to have myself on mute because as you were saying some of those things, I was laughing along with you and cheering a little bit just because you're right. The extremes are always going to have, or the extremists on each story are always going to have their perfect reasons that they're right. And I think you're correct when you say that somewhere in the middle is probably the correct answer. With that said,
well, it's a very frustrating thing because I'm sort of all for supporting law enforcement to maintain the lifestyle that we have today, because certainly in a place like Australia, I love the lifestyle we have here. I don't want to see bad stuff happen to people. But then you see some of these communications. I mean, as we sort of rushed this bill through in Australia towards the end of last year, we kept hearing from the government, we want to keep Aussies safe before Christmas. So what do you mean? Like, you're going to do this and suddenly we're going to be safe as opposed to now when we're not safe, and we're going to sort of transition through this binary position of absolute safety versus no safety. Like, it's just a ridiculous premise. And it's really unfortunate because I find myself wanting to support the intent of these initiatives, but just face palming at the execution of them.
It's funny that you mentioned before Christmas. How many memes did you have about Santa Claus bombing Canberra as that was coming out? Santa Claus. I imagine. So, with all that said, and the story coming out about how the U.S. government agency was able to reach out to a third-party company in Israel, theoretically, to provide the decryption capability that they had asked for and ultimately did not get through Apple. Where does that lie on your scale of suitability as far as, okay, you went through the legal process, you got a no, and then you went to somebody in a different country altogether and got a yes in an indirect way? Where does that sit with you as far as they shouldn't have done that, or it's okay, do what you got to do?
I think a lot of this comes back to one of the great fears that we all have, and this is a very sort of post-Snowden thing as well, is that we're worried about the mass collection of data outside any necessary context to have it. There should be no reason, for example, to be collecting conversations I have like this or chats I have with my friends. This is the sort of thing that we're worried about in terms of privacy violations. But by the same token, and putting the difficulty of execution aside, I think most of us are okay with the concept of law enforcement accessing the communications of genuinely bad people. And again, there's sort of a self-interest part of this as well, right? Because we want to live in safe environments. The trick then is how do you have both worlds? And people are very concerned about sort of lawful processes. So certainly with our AA bill here in Australia, there is a lawful process for gaining access to data, but we're worried about the extent of lawfulness insofar as does this provide access to information that maybe you shouldn't have, or is there enough judicial oversight and enough transparency? So we lament those aspects of it. When we get to something like San Bernardino and we say, and now this is also assuming all of this is on face value as well, because I'm sure there was a huge amount of politics at play here. Let's say Apple did end up paying $1 million to an Israeli security firm for an exploit to access this one person's phone. If the barrier to entry was genuinely that this target had to be valuable enough to invest $1 million, then I'm pretty okay with that. It's like, well, that's one bad dude. Like if the government's going to spend $1 million, the government doesn't have a lot of spare cash to throw around on these things. Look at how much they pay people. So if their barrier to entry is like $1 million and we're willing to spend that to get into someone's communication, then fantastic. Now, whether that then gives them the capability, now they've spent the $1 million, to go and unlock everyone's device, that might be a different story. But even then, by the same token, if it comes down to something like you need to have physical access of the device, and there's a judicial process on top of that as well, where you have to have a court order or some form of oversight, in order to get access to it. I think that's the sort of thing that would probably sit well with most people. And again, the nuance there is always whether that oversight is sufficient or not, and whether that access is really warranted for the nature of the crime. But that genuinely sits okay with me.
Right on. That's a good answer. I want to swing back just a moment and kind of backtrack a little bit towards the front side of this conversation. You mentioned about your site and kind of what you thought your site would be. When I say your site, for those just tuning in, I'm talking about Have I Been Pwned by Troy Hunt, our guest. You mentioned that people send you information that's probably been out there already, and you're collating it, or some of it doesn't get known until it hits your site. Let's talk for a moment, for those that may not know, the difference between the function of your site and what you're doing with it and why you are putting this information out there versus, a site like, the old leakedsource.com site that has been shut down, of course. But, those paid disclosure sites have a very different purpose than yours. And if you can you just kind of highlight what those differences are?
One of the first things here is that when I started Have I Been Pwned, I didn't go out and look at other sites and go, wow, I like this bit, I don't like that bit. This is something I think I can replicate. I didn't look at any of them. I just went out and thought, this is a good idea. I'll just go and build it. And it was only after I launched it, people went, there are actually some other sites that do this. Oh, okay, interesting. Okay, so what? So I moved on. Obviously, over time, as more of these services have popped up, there's things that I've looked at a little bit more closely. And you mentioned Leaked Source, which was probably one of the most, I think notorious is probably the right word, examples. And their value proposition, so they would have popped up probably about 3 years ago. Their value proposition was it's a bit like Have I Been Pwned, enter an email address, but then give us some money and then you can download all of the data in the data breaches. So I'll give you a good example. I have been in 15 different data breaches now, my own personal data. So what you'd be able to do, and people actually did this on my behalf and sent it to me, you'd be able to go and pay these guys some money, search my email address, and then go and get not just my email address, but passwords I've used. They were cracking passwords as well if they were stored as weak cryptographic hashes. Passwords, date of birth, personal details, like whatever they had. It was just like, hey, here's everything on Troy. And they were selling this information to people for the sake of a few bucks. And then they'd have some fine print. It's like, don't use this to do illegal things. And it's... at the same time sort of advertising on hacking forums. So their motives were obviously very financially centric by providing a commercial model first and foremost to access this data. And then obviously also their intent of how the data was used was to do people harm. There was also a lot of data flowing into this service that hadn't been seen anywhere else before, and a lot of people sort of speculating that, these guys are paying for data breaches. I think that's an immutable fact, but also paying people to execute data breaches, allegedly paying them to execute data breaches in order to seed the system with more information, because then, of course, people will in turn pay for the access. So that's all sorts of level of shady, and I was really concerned, I've got to be honest, particularly in like 2016, I was getting very concerned that services like this were being viewed in the same light as a service like Have I Been Pwned, which only ever has email addresses. Anyone can go and access it for free, and it will tell you where you're exposed, and that's it. And I was worried that it was sort of, I guess, lowering the perception of all of these services into a very shady area. And it might only be a matter of time before law enforcement steps in and goes, look, no, you just can't do this sort of stuff because of the risks it poses people. And then we get through to about 2 years ago, early 2017, and the site just disappears. It's just gone offline, and there's some cryptic messages about FBI raiding and things like this. And it later eventuates that a guy in I think he's in about his mid-20s in Canada, has been arrested. There's photos of him driving around in a green Lamborghini. Like, pro tip, if you want to fly under the radar, don't drive around in a green Lamborghini as a mid-20-year-old. But he got picked up and charged. I'm actually not sure what's happened since. I think he was facing a whole bunch of different charges around things like trafficking in identity data, which seems like a reasonable charge. And fortunately, that sort of did get knocked off, and I honestly feel that the industry sort of took a little bit of an upturn after that, insofar as have I been pwned and other mainstream legitimate services that do similar things were no longer sort of cast in the same light.
I read once that you had mentioned, if you had a fantasy car, you mentioned in a previous interview years ago, Ferrari. And now you mentioned this guy's Lamborghini. So I'm just, I see a pattern here with high-end. I'm kidding.
I'm a car guy, so I can see the attraction of buying a Lamborghini. Like I get that. I guess my point is that when you're doing so with effectively the proceeds of crime from dealing in people's stolen identity data, a little bit more subtlety might have gone in his favor.
So you're saying like a Ford Fusion or some other like...
Yeah, a push bike. You get a push bike, mate. Not an expensive one either.
That's right. That's right. Let's take a minute. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to take a minute from an educational perspective. And what's your best advice? Now, earlier on you mentioned about password reuse, and for those that don't know what that means, that just means that you are using the same password over and over at every different website or everything that you log into, which in the IT field is supposed to be a no-no. And clearly you mentioned we all know that it happens, and many of us in the IT field even do it too. So with that said, what is your best advice when it comes to passwords? Do you suggest password managers? Do you clearly, hopefully you're not suggesting write it down on a spreadsheet and keep that close, but what can people do to try to remember their passwords yet figure out how to be best practice?
Well, it's a tricky thing because, and to be fair as well, I've certainly gone through periods of my life where I've reused passwords and had weak ones all over the place. Like let me just acknowledge that before launching into my tirade about how to do this properly. It is a hard thing now because particularly in this industry we have a lot of different online accounts. And I suspect for your listeners, if they genuinely sit down and add them all up, I'll be very surprised if they don't have a triple-digit number of accounts somewhere or other over the period of years. And obviously this depends on how long you've been creating accounts for. But for me, getting on the internet in the early days and then signing up to everything from shopping sites to I want to buy a movie ticket to airlines to everything else, I mean, I've got hundreds and hundreds of different online accounts. Now, we all hear this advice about strong passwords, and you probably see the posters at work, and we see the National Cybersecurity Safety Days in different countries and things. Create strong passwords that are unique. Good luck. And then they sort of go away and somehow figure out how to do this. Now, we know that strength means that predictable strings are out. Like your dog's name and the name or the year you were born is just not going to cut it. So you can't do that. We know that strength also involves things like randomness, so not having predictability in passwords. So the sort of the concept of what makes a strong password, I think, is pretty well understood. The concept of uniqueness is very simple. Just don't use the same one in multiple places. But then you're like, so hang on, so I have these hundreds, or even if you just distill it down to the more important one, dozens of passwords, and they all have to be things that are by no means predictable, ergo easy to remember, and they all have to be different. Like, how do you do this? Now, unless you're Rain Man, and if you are Rain Man, good on you, you've solved the problem. But for the rest of us, you're pretty much back to needing to keep a record of it somehow. And like you said, look, a spreadsheet on your desktop may be not the best way of doing that. Although, in fairness, I'll probably get lynched for this, but I would argue that a spreadsheet on your desktop, even unencrypted, sitting there next to all your other files, is almost certainly going to be a better security posture than using the same password everywhere. Because we've just been speaking about things like data breaches and the way they circulate and how many communities there are that exchange them backwards and forwards. And if your password is in that list, you are well and truly screwed. A lot harder to actually pull it off your desktop than to pull it out of a data breach. Be that as it may, what we really want to do is drive people towards cryptographic password managers like 1Password. So I use one from a company called AgileBits. They create the 1Password password manager. I've used that for about the last 8 years, and I put every single password I create in there, and it's a crazy random generated one. So many of my passwords are 30, 40 characters, whatever the website allows. and I've got no idea what they are. But because the tool integrates into the browser and integrates into my iPhone, every time I authenticate into something, I unlock either biometrically or with the one strong password that I need. That's the one master password. And then that unlocks the device and gets me access to my keychain. And that today is really the best mousetrap that we have, using a password manager so that you've got this one super secure software product which then secures every other account that you have online.
That is, that's the advice that I like to give myself, is making sure that you use something that's not the same thing. Like you said, you can't continually type the same password over and over and expect good results. With all of the last 6 months of breaches, and since you worked for Pfizer, who is in the healthcare industry amongst other industries, what do you see that there is a specific industry right now that's under siege? I work in healthcare, and it feels like to me that we are under siege as far as because of the type of data that we store. But clearly financial industries and retailers and others also store some pretty important data. So even if we expand that to the last year, do you feel like there's a specific industry that somehow is becoming a more common target? Do you just feel like it's still just everybody, and I only hear it because I'm in the field? But do you see that somebody's being targeted more than others lately?
Yeah, the ones on the internet. Honestly, that's kind of the baseline, right? You are on the internet, therefore you're targeted. But maybe to drill a little bit deeper on that, I mentioned earlier, as soon as you put anything on the internet, you start seeing attacks against it. I'll put up a brand new Microsoft ASP.NET application, and I'll see attacks looking for PHP admin pages. It's not personal; they're just scanning the internet. So everyone is subject to that. Everyone is subject to crimes of opportunity, for want of a better term. In one of the talks I do, I'm talking about SQL injection, still the number one risk on the web today. I show a video this kid's made on YouTube, and there are dozens, probably hundreds of videos the same, where he's like, I'm going to show you how to do a SQL injection attack. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to search for a URL that has a query string in it. I'm going to take the first result. So my criteria of choosing who to attack here is that you come up first in Google. So basically, if your SEO is good, it's like you're a bigger target. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is a lot of these attacks are indiscriminate and they're opportunistic. And regardless of the industry you work in, that's going to be a problem. Now, of course, there's also much more targeted attacks, and things like the finance industry, well, evidently there's a lot of money there. We've seen some interesting attacks against things like Swift banking system in recent years. Well, there's huge amounts of money going backwards and forwards there. We've certainly seen allegedly nation-state-backed attacks against the likes of the financial institutions because that's where a heap of the money is. Healthcare, obviously super sensitive information, sensitive personal information that has not just a high value for attackers, but a really high impact on the organizations involved. We've seen multiple extortion attempts over the years, including to the likes of Uber. Another story altogether there. But attacks where obviously the attackers are looking at the organization going, this is a company that has money that might be willing to pay for this. And of course now in more recent years, what's really coming to the fore is the awareness of state-backed hacking, which has always been there, but now we've got more and more stuff online. We're getting greater visibility into when these attacks happen. And when you think about things like the 2016 election hacks, one of the things that I really lament here is that so much of that was very subtle manipulation as well as sort of old school hacking into vulnerable systems. And I kind of wonder what it's going to look like in the future, where we're talking about not just the sort of never-ending series of flaws in software or misconfigurations as well. The number of people just simply forgetting to put passwords on databases is crazy. But then we're also going through to the fact that particularly nation states see that there's a huge amount of power in being able to manipulate these systems to impact social perceptions and viewpoints and consequently elections. And yeah, I think that's a fascinating time.
Many of us in the U.S. agree. There are plenty of us who wonder 2020, what that's going to look like. If 2016 is what it was, what will 2020 look like? Because so many people tend to just buy what they see. If they trust a website or a Twitter account or something, they tend to just buy it hook, line, and sinker, and without taking a look at the original source of that info. And that's a scary thought, no doubt about it.
Well, we're all subject to this, right? And we all, I guess, suffer from a bit of confirmation bias too. If we see something that supports our point of view, we're more likely to share that. We're more likely to socialize it because it's again, reinforcing our own worldview. Now, how much time do you actually spend researching sources on this? Well, probably very, very little. I laugh at the number of times I see, particularly friends on Facebook, non-technical friends, and you can always see this coming because the message is always all capitals. It's always all capitals. They've copied and pasted it from somewhere, and it's going to be something like anything from there are pedophiles in your area stalking your children, oh my God, burn all your Facebooks and it will fix it, through to unless you put this message on your wall right now, Facebook owns all of your stuff. And you sort of see this stuff coming, and even when it's like really, really obviously just fabricated crap, it somehow gets traction. So what hope do we have when it's really subtle influences, either through mainstream media or other channels which alleged to be mainstream? If we can't spot the really obvious rubbish, what chance do we have at this sort of subtle mental influence stuff?
So what you're telling me is your Facebook page is where posts like post this now to get $1 million go to die. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, I think a lot of my timeline is me replying to people like, here is a 2-second Google search and here's the Snopes article on why all of this is absolutely fabricated. Maybe you could do a Google too.
Right on, that's hilarious. All right, we've run out of time. Troy, again, I cannot say thank you enough for taking the time this morning, your time, to wake up and speak with us. And before I let you go, is there anything that we didn't cover that you thought, dang, Dave, I thought for sure you'd ask, or is there anything that you want to promote, an appearance that you have, or anything? I don't care what it is. Is there anything that you want to promote out there?
No, look, I think we covered it well. I mean, people know what Have I Been Pwned does. There's a free notification service there where you can leave your email address, and I'll let you know if I find you somewhere later on. And if anyone wants to catch up with me anywhere, I keep an upcoming events list on the right-hand side of my blog, and there'll be a few more to plug in there shortly, including some upcoming US ones as well.
Outstanding. Well, again, thank you for so much of your time, and sorry that I'll miss you next week or next month, and not at RSA, but hopefully I catch up to you again soon.
My pleasure.
Well, there it is. Troy Hunt, thank you, sir. I appreciate your time. Man, what a great opportunity to get a chance to talk to somebody of that stature as far as the research goes. Clearly he's a nice guy, as we talked to him, that came out. Having not met him in person yet, again, clearly, I only know as much as I know from the on-air part, but great stuff. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully you learned something new about something you didn't know about already. And coming up next week on Tuesday, I'll start talking about the RSA Security Conference out in San Francisco. We're going to start throwing a couple interviews prior to that event happening of speakers and other people who will be out there. And then while I'm out there, I will be doing some live stuff. So you can actually tune in on Twitter or other places and check me out. I will be doing some live casting, 5-10 minute interviews here and there, just to kind of seed the Twitter feed a little bit, have some fun with that. And of course, we'll be recording some more longer form interviews as well that I will collate together and get ready for the show as I come back. So great stuff. Again, haveibeenpwned.com. If you've never heard of that site, go check it out. It's a great resource for some cool stuff. Before I jump out of here, I want to say thank you again to Misty for doing my promos.
So you need a high-quality intro for your podcast, but money doesn't grow on trees. I get it, and I got you. Bold podcast intros and outros. Professional production quality, starting at just a 5-spot. To order yours, go to fiverr.com/mvproductions.
All right. Thanks again to Misty for those intros and outros for me. And thanks again to all of you for tuning in tonight. I hope it was great. and I appreciate you. So until next week, I am Dave the IT Guy, and good night, everyone.
Okay, that's it. Hopefully you've been inspired to learn more, or at the very least, heard something new that you didn't know already. Don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at BYOS Radio and Facebook at facebook.com/BYOS Radio. You can download each episode from iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and just about any other podcasting software you like. You can also listen live every Tuesday night at 9 Eastern from the BringYourOwnSecurity.net website. You might even learn CPE for your IT certifications, so tune in weekly.